Way back in part 9 of this series, we covered the trials and tribulations of steam bending. Springback, or the tendency of a bent piece of wood to try to return to its original shape, is to some degree unavoidable. Unfortunately, I got a little cocky and likely jinxed myself.
There was remarkably little springback. Remarkably little springback.
In the course of moving from my old shop to the new, with a pit stop in the church basement, the frame that was supposed to look like this sprung back to this. This opened up major gaposis at the bottom of the frame. As painful as the thought was, I ultimately came to the conclusion that I would have to cut the frame apart at the apex in order to correct this. This ended up transferring the gap to the top, where I was intending to clad it with some sort of faux keystone anyway, so it ended up being a reasonable solution. The other issue was that the dado I had created was too narrow for the final width of the sign sandwich. This was fairly easy to address by widening the dado with a slot cutting bit on my router table. I could have used a dado stack on the table saw for the straight frame piece, but this would not have worked for the rest of the frame. To keep it symmetrical, I routed one side, flipped the piece, and then did the other. I was in the midst of installing the floor in the new shop, so dust collection was suboptimal. Serendipitously, cutting the frame in half made this process a whole lot easier. In reviewing the footage, I was horrified to see this dangling strap, which could easily have gotten caught by the exposed bit. In the best case, this would have ripped the mask off my face, and I don't really want to think about the worst case. Regardless, it was a mistake that I got away with and hope to never repeat.
Yes?
I then test fit the frame, confirming that it corrected the problem at the bottom, with the expected gap at the apex. I used a somewhat tenuous clamp setup to close the gap as much as possible and decided on a stainless steel bolt and threaded insert combo to hold the two halves together. I then made an overly elaborate but still somewhat janky setup to drill the counter bores. This worked well, but I made a mistake when I drilled the actual bore using this setup. This used the cut surface as a reference, but because of the gap, the bore on the other side went way off target.
No.
I accepted the side that was close and installed the threaded insert as originally planned. And did a mulligan of my mulligan by plugging the other hole with a dowel. I then thought, why not overcomplicate it even more? So I designed and 3D printed a gap filling piece. With this in place, I used the ginger left paw dead reckoning technique to guide the drill, which fortunately worked out quite well.
Yes?
I broke my spacer in the process, so I made a new one with a cutout for the bolts. So now I had something that was functional, if a bit ugly. I then moved on to the finishing process. I started by sanding everything. There was a bark inclusion on the back that I cleaned out and filled with epoxy. then rounded over all the edges. It was around this point that I realized that the bottom of the frame would collect water, which would greatly decrease the longevity of the sign if I did nothing about it. I ended up routing drain channels from the middle of the sign out to either side, ending in discrete drain holes that should effectively address the problem. Rather than take the time to set up a complicated jig to create a smooth slope for the drain channels, I simply chose to step the depths to try and guide the water down to the drain holes. At this point, it was the dead of winter, so I chose a finish that I could use inside without poisoning myself. And on Christmas Day 2022, I started the finishing process. In the end, it came together about as perfectly as I could have hoped. To cover up these shenanigans, I ended up making a decorative cap, which I'll cover in the next video.